we thank Dr. Jiang Wu and for giving us such a wonderful and interesting presentation about Chinese Buddhist canon. I think after the first two lectures today, then you won't feel that this topic is not what you think before, right? Because people could imagine that it is about the scholar discussion about the Buddhist canon, but actually there are a lot of interesting topics about journey to the West, about the four characters in that journey, and then about maybe some motive behind the writers writing that. So I hope that after hearing, by the end of that journey to the West, it says that you don't have to read the text. You just recite or read the titles, the catalog, and then I hope that you won't be brainwashed by that. And then in our poster, I announced that the 8 topics of our lecture series. Don't just read the topics. You have to attend the class either online or on-site to get the real feeling of what the Chinese Buddhist canon is. So I will see you tomorrow. Thank you. Yeah, tomorrow is 1 to 4 o'clock.
The kind of the imagination surrounding the canon is also very important. Right? So religious imagination should be recognized as the middle ground between reality and faith. Right? So of course, faith is the upper level. But however, religious imagination is somehow mitigate between the reality and faith, where the issue of truth value of religious statements can be temporarily suspended. Right? So when we talk about imagination, we don't care about truth value. Right? The truth value of those statements, of course, waits for further investigation. But however, it has such kind of value which temporarily suspends the truth value. It creates a between zone. Right? It's kind of a buffer zone, which will not be judged by true or false. It also allows sudden perception or intuition, something beyond reason, making connections and providing extra temporal vision. So what is important for religious imagination is it creates great vision. It creates a vision. So relation between faith and imagination. Right? So there's faith cannot be separated from imagination, right? Because faith without imagination will end up listless, right? Not interesting anymore. Religious rituals and symbols would remain silent without the imagination about the events and the meaning behind them. Right? So religious imagination absolutely enrich faith. Even though people understand their significance intellectually. Right? Without imagination, religious symbols have the danger of being reduced as seen as mere signs. Right? It could be just signs, right? Devoid of spiritual power. Right? Imagination actually empowers the symbols and signs. Imagination, however, restores the multiple dimensions of the symbol and enriches their meanings. Right? So this is my kind of a theoretical reflection about the role of imagination. So imagination also has the function of connection. Right? In imagination, we connect with different kinds of things, something you cannot reach, right, with your reason. So linking us between the reality and ideals, between various possibilities, mediating the relationship between human and non-humans, individual and the society, past and future, rising population and environment among different races by imagining a world and harmonious coexistence. So this is something we should kind of pay attention to, because imagination really allows us to reach out. So imagination allows us to bridge the gap or discontinuity which cannot be mended by reason, in contrast to rational thinking. Right? So this is something we value the most, which aggressively seeks to impose its result as universal and the categorical conclusion. Imagination is invitational. Right? It is an invitation. It's only our job, right? Do you want to accept the invitation or not? Right? In nature, and only entice people to unfreeze or unseize. Right? Probably this is a little bit abstract for some of you, right? But however, here my point is that the approach I adopt here, right, is a very sophisticated one, right? So I have thought about a lot, right? I think this should be included in our study of religious subject, right? So I continue here. Imagination gives us a free rein of our image-making faculty. We all have that ability. And turn religion into something visual and visionary, right? So later I will show you images, right? You can see the Canon tradition is very colorful, providing inspiration for religious art. In such vision, religion is shrouded with a unique ethereal atmosphere which points to mystery and the transcendence. It is not unreal or surreal. Rather, it is an extension of our world based on the landscape of our environment and recognizable elements in our reality. Imagination enriches the experience where believers encounter with the sacred, which reason fails to deliver. Right? So here what I'm saying is that reason has its limits. Right? So largely, we need to use imagination to bridge the gap. Right? Bridge the gap. Right? And the imagination is not something completely groundless, by the way. Right? It's actually grounded upon our experience. Right? We have experience with certain image or certain experience, then we build upon that and extended it. Right? Extended it. It's okay if you don't understand this concept right now. Right? So I mean, I have I told you I have a more elaborated argument in my paper. Right? So probably in the future I'm going to continue to develop that. Right? But here you can see my approach here. Right? We did not go directly into the canon, the structure, or something more factual in this lecture, but we study a lot about imagination, about consciousness and mentality. Right? Okay, so here let's look at the canon. Right? So I want to kind of overview some kind of common knowledge about the canon. Right? So somehow we know what the canon is about. We translate Tripitaka as canon. Right? And we know it's based on 3 baskets, right? So Vinaya first, but in Chinese tradition, Sutra becomes the first, right? And Abhidhamma Sastra, right? So 3 baskets, we know naturally they have been put together. So the Sutra Vinaya section took form right during the first council, right? According to some versions, right? The Abhidhamma was gradually added, right? Some version says actually they all come together at the same time, right? So this is, however, not the only way to look at the Buddhist canon, right, or the body of Buddhist texts, because we have a different kind of a classification in the Buddhist tradition, such as the 9 divisions or 12 divisions, right, based on the literature, the job, the style of the literature. Right. So there are multiple ways to look at the body of literature in the Indian tradition. So here's the map, right? So I can, for students of Indian Buddhism, this is most familiar, and we can identify those places related to the canon on the map, right? Along the Ganges River, you have Rajagriha, Vaisali, Nalanda, all those places, right? So later we're going to refer to those places. Right? So we know these are our common knowledge about first council, right? Rajagriha, right? 500 arhants, right? Sometimes we call this 500. Arahant council, right? Shortly after Buddha's death, Rajagriha, right? So we know some monks, right, appear to be very happy about Buddha's going, and because they can do whatever they want, right? So Mahakasyapa, right, summoned 500 arhants, right? So they gathered together and relayed Buddhist canon, right? Tripitaka, Vinaya Sutra Abhidhamma. So, and then was believed to be the person who relayed the sutra part. So this is what we know. The second, at Vaisali, about 100, 110 years, then there are issues about practice. So whenever there's such a canon, most of all, that's about the precepts, right, disciplines. So then there are about arguments about 10 different kinds of things the monks should do or should not do. Right? So then there are some elders apparently are very angry, upset about this kind of practice. Then the second council was convened. So this is something what we know, right? But I'm not a scholar on Indian Buddhism, right? Early Indian Buddhism, right? But in the case we want to understand what's going on there, we got to ask more questions, right? Because the sources, based on Pali or Indian and also the Chinese tradition, they all conflict each other, right? So we have lost tremendous amount of work which devoted to the councils, but still we don't have consensus, right? So the question is fundamentally, was there really such a canon, right? What we imagine in the Chinese tradition actually exists in India, right? We translate immediately the Tripitaka as a canon, right? But however, we got to understand, right, the Tripitaka, the writing system, right, during Buddha's time, right, has not yet been applied to the creation of Buddhist texts and the canon, right, which means the oral tradition is actually the overwhelming the way to transmit a literature, right, the kind of literature. Right? So the Tripitaka actually can be viewed, right, according to some scholars, actually division of labors. We divided the Buddha's teaching into different parts, and some monks, they specialize in certain kind of scripture or vinaya. Right? So they are responsible to memorize, to recite those scriptures. Right? So what's council about? Council is about getting people together, to recite them together. Right? So then you have a sense of assembly here, and then the question, where is the canon? Because people don't write. Right? You don't have the physical manuscript, printed book in front of you, or put together in the library, don't have that at the council, then the council is about all of us, right? Or people who have been here reciting. It's all of us. Right? But after the council, when people are gone, people carry the kind of a tradition, the basket with themselves. Right? Nobody, he himself, can actually memorize the entire canon, all the parts. Right? So each individual scripture or text in the Indian tradition actually has its distinctive oral tradition, their own transmission. So very often such kind of a transmission record has been attached to some of the translated texts. Right? So we have a text translated into Chinese, so they have their transmission. Right? So last night I was reading a history of Indian Buddhism by a Chinese scholar, Zhou Shujia, and he said something very interesting. The Chinese Buddhists got it all wrong. Right, especially the Zen Buddhists. Right? They thought Bodhidharma came with the transmission of Dharma. Right? Bodhidharma indeed came with the transmission. But however, his view is that this is not transmission of the Dharma, it's simply transmission of the text. Right? So he has his lineage. His teacher told him, because it's all orally transmitted. Right? So he recorded that. Right? It's nothing about Dharma. Right? Nothing about Dharma. So then you can figure out, okay, so this is probably not the case that we have something like the Chinese tradition, right? In the beginning, when the canon was created, right? Although we use canon, we have to keep this in mind. This is a very different kind of canon, right? If there's indeed such a canonical tradition. Right? And there, as I said, there are just too many sources about the Buddhist councils, right? So then we have, once again, I'm quoting Lamonte's comments about this vast amount of sources, right? So, and he says something very interesting. Few historical problems have cost so much ink, which means scholars' effort, right, to flow as that of the Buddhist councils. Right? So much has been written about the council, right? Because whenever you study that, you'll find there are new sources, but they say something quite different about what is going on here. So my approach here, as I said, we start from people's mind, right? We want to understand what's going on in people's mind, and we need to pay attention to this kind of a nonsense. Right? Sometimes the numbers or the things doesn't make sense to us, but it makes sense to Asian people. The people who want to make canon, it makes great sense to them. Right? So I'm talking about here a Tripitaka Discourse. Right? It's a discourse, and the people talk about the canon, right, in their own way. It's not our way, probably, right? But however, it's people in the Asian time, right, 5th, 6th century, when they tried to make a Chinese canon. Right? So we call this kind of a legends discourse, primarily comprised of legends, right? The legends of counselors. And Sun Yu, here I'm using a lot of Sun Yu's work. He was a monk, right? An eminent monk living in the 5th century, and he wrote a catalog of Buddhist texts, and in which he actually, it's not just a catalog, by the way, it actually contains many legends, right? Stories he kind of extracted from translated Buddhist scriptures. Right? So here what he's trying is actually put things together and created a version about Buddhist canon, the Tripitaka, what it is, right? How it comes into being. Right? Of course, in this kind of a discourse making, we see the role, right? The function, the play of religious imagination. So our goal here is not try to find which is true, which is false, and where the evidence is, we can pinpoint to a real canon. Right? It's not about that. Right? But I would want to solve this question: what are the sources of Chinese imagination? Right? So first, let me talk about some kind of source we need to identify. Right? There are different types of sources we use to understand such kind of imagination. Right? So the first type are the translated scriptures. Right? So we have Savastivada Vinaya, which is primarily contains the precepts, right? But however, in the kind of a discourse, the Buddhist canon, right? How Buddhist canon was made also has been kind of recorded, right? Scriptures of the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva. This is actually one of the most fascinating texts, and Sun Yu used that a lot. Sun Yu used that a lot. Right? Mahaprajna Paramita Sastra, right? So this is also one of the great texts, treatises of great wisdom. Right? So all these are Mahayana texts. They had a great influence in the Chinese, right? Among the Chinese. The second type, actually, the Chinese anthologies. Right? As I said, the Chinese tried to assemble all these sources, discourses together. Then we have the Chinese compilations. Right? So these are all the Chinese compilations, and they, of course, these learned Chinese monks, they read translated text, and they made things together. They extract stories about canon and put it together, try to reconcile the different discrepancies. And there are some of the works I have consulted. Right? The third type actually are tribal writings. As I said, the Journey to the West, you probably remember, is based on the monks who did pilgrimage in India, right? Xuanzang. And we have more than this one person. There are lots of them. Some of them simply passed away during their journey, and some, unfortunately, they came back. Right? So then, when they came back, they wrote down their travels in India. Right? So in those travelogue, they actually documented the legend or what did they have seen in India. Right? When you visit the place, if they say there's a council has been assembled, assembly has been made during there, they went there. Right? So these are the major types, right? 3 types of documents I have consulted. And then let's look at this kind of imagination surrounding the Tripitaka, the canon, right? So according to my study, I summarize everything. I think there are 5 different themes or aspects we can get from this kind of sources. Right? The first, all of the sources, they all talk about the events that's led to the creation of the canon. Right? So there's something happened. So I mentioned Mahakasyapa, Ananda. Right? So they assemble 500 people together at Rajagriha. Right? So then that's the events. Right? So there are events here. The second is about the creation of Mahayana canon. Right? So scholars dismiss this. It couldn't be the case. The Mahayana, we know historically came rather late, right? Maybe the 1st century BC, right? But however, during Buddha's time, no Mahayana, right? So it's nonsense to talk about the Mahayana canon, right? But very interestingly, lots of Mahayana sources they mentioned during that time. There's already such kind of Mahayana canon, right? So we don't dismiss that. Right? Number 3 is very interesting, kind of a claim that canon, when it was created, actually already been written down, right, and it become a physical object. There's a physical existence of the canon. Right? We know that couldn't be true because during Buddhist time, writing has not been that prolific. Right? Number 4 is about the actual location. If it is actually a physical existence, it got to be somewhere. Right? It got to be somewhere. So where it is. Right? So then we have a fanciful kind of imagination about Dragon's Palace, right? Heavenly Palace, right? This sounds like legend, something not worth studying. But later, in the next lecture, you will see actually people made something, right? Made a structure based on that, right? To store Buddhist canon, right? Obviously based on this kind of legend. Right? So number 5 is about number, right? Once again, in this lecture, starting from lecture 2, we encounter some interesting numbers. Right? We will continue to investigate that, see how people actually use numbers in their way of understanding Chinese Buddhist canon. So the first, let's look at the events. Right? So there are the Chinese sources, of course, notice this various kind of account, discrepancies. So then the first council, people know, right? This is convened by the Mahakasyapa, right, the Raja Gerha, right? And then the related sutra section. So then there's 4 agamas, for example, right? And the Upali related to Vinaya section. Right? So all these numbers, and there are discrepancies about exactly how many members in the first council. Right? Standard version is about 500, right? But another version says 1,000. There actually another legend says somebody assembled in the cave, right? Somebody else assembled outside the cave. So actually 2 different kind of assembly were going on simultaneously. But however, all the sources unanimously about Ananda. Right? So Ananda is a very problematic kind of figure during the first council, because when Kasyapa summoned all the monks, Ananda hasn't reached enlightenment yet. Right? He was not technically Arahant. So everybody questioned him. He has done something terrible, not something terrible, but failed to accomplish things, such as asking the Buddha before he passed away, what exactly are those petty or minor disciplines which should not be included in canon. This is something else. Relationship with women, for example. In the Mahayana sources, he's such kind of a weak person. Surangama Sutra, for example, just based entirely on Ananda's fault. Right? So they have something unanimous about, but there are more discrepancies. Here I give you some example. For example, I mentioned this sutra on the incarnation of bodhisattvas. This is actually a very interesting text. And in this text, right, Sung Yu actually quoted this. It's not me, I discovered this. It's actually Sung Yu, right? He already recorded, take this into his catalog and translated by Arthur Link. Right? So I think here I simply use his translation. There are actually 8 such kind of pitkas. We all know there are 3 baskets, but however, according to this version, it's actually 8. Right? It's actually 8. Right? So one of them is actually the Bodhisattva Pitaka. Right? So Bodhisattva is the kind of ideal of the Mahayana Buddhism. Whenever we see the Bodhisattva, there could be the case that mostly the scripture deals with the Mahayana tradition. Right? So Bodhisattva Pitaka, for example, becomes one. Right? A very distinctive kind of category. Right? So then we see this is very interesting variation here. Right? It's 3 or 4. There are different accounts, actually 5. In addition to the 3 Pitakas, there are actually miscellaneous Pitakas. So here we have a version of 8. Right? It's probably one of the extreme, but a very interesting kind of account. So exactly what they refer to, we have no idea. So then there's another text, for example, a Chinese text, right, quoted in a work by Kuei-ji, right? And this book, I believe, is lost. Right? Probably is still there. We have a fragment of the manuscript, but however, in Kuei-ji's work, we can somehow get a kind of a view about what this work, right, about assembling the 3 Tripitakas, the Tripitakas, record of assembling the Buddhist canon. That's basically the title says. Right? So the book actually deals with Buddhist counsel. What it says is that, I just mentioned one kind of interesting point made by the author of this lost book. The author believes actually there are 3 Anandas. right? So I never heard about this. Actually, the Ananda at the time, he related the first Ananda, right? Related something which is Sravaka Pitaka. Right? The second Ananda, right? Ananda Bhadra, right? Related something called Pratyaka Buddha Pitaka. And the third one related something Bodhisattva Pitaka. If you understand Mahayana teaching in Lotus Sutra, these are the three vehicles. Right? These are the three vehicles, although they all return to the Buddha vehicle. But these are the three vehicles. In this work, it gives us an account, a legend, that there are actually three Anandas who related to three different kind of canons for Tripitakas, for Pitakas, for different vehicles. So you see, the tradition itself is very rich. Right? If we talk about legends and the imagination. Right? In addition to that, as I mentioned, I also rely on the eyewitness reports. Right? Here I mean the travelogue, right? The travelogues. Right? Fa Xian, for example, he went to India. Last night, people asked about Fa Xian. Right? Absolutely, he was one of the great pilgrims in history. He actually recorded. This is a translation. Right? So I copied from James Ladd's translation. Right? Going on still to the west of the 5 or 6 li, right, the Chinese mile, on the north of the hill in the shade, they found the cabin called Sratapachna, the place where after the Nirvana of Buddha, 500 arhats collected the sutra. Right? So this is somehow corresponding to the written sources. When they brought the sutra forth, 3 lofty seeds had been prepared and grandly ornamented. Right? So this is something we don't know. Shariputra occupied the one on the left, Madhukayana on the right, of course in the center that's Mahakasyapa. Right? He is the president of the council. Ananda was then outside the door. As I said, Ananda was more problematic, could not get in because he has now reached enlightenment. At the place there was reached the toad, right, which is still existing. This is something we don't know. But however, Fa Xian went there, right, so he said, if we trust him, right, maybe something has been happening around that place. That place becomes a holy place, right, holy place, because that's the place actually Canon has been created. Xuanzang, right, so I mentioned this, most famous great traveler, the kind of an archetype for the Tripitaka master in Journey to the West. He said that he went there as well, a little bit different. Or this is probably a couple hundred years later, 3 or 200 years later. 5 or 6 li, Chinese miles to the southwest from the bamboo garden at the north of the South Mountain. There is a large cave in a great bamboo grove. Mahakasyapa and 999 great arhats. You see here the number here? It's different from the 500. 99, of course, plus Mahakasyapa that makes 1,000. To collect the Tripitaka after the Nirvana of the Tasarpta. In front of the cave are the old foundation of the hall built by King Ajatasashtra for the great arhat who took part in collecting the Dhamma Pitaka. So he has something very interesting and a little bit different from what Fa Xian said. So this is somehow the kind of I just try to show you, right? So this kind of shows sources, they tell different things. So the second aspect or theme identified in this kind of a Tripitaka discourse is the creation of the Mahayana Canon, right? Creation of Mahayana Canon. Right? So I already mentioned this is very problematic historically, right? So considerable attention has been given to the creation of the Mahayana Canon because Chinese tradition is distinctively Mahayana. But however, the example, we have Dajilulu in the great wisdom treatise. Right? It says Maitreya and Manjushri actually took Ananda, right, to somewhere else, Iron Mountain. Well, this is something, where is that, right? If you understand Buddhist cosmology, this is actually the kind of a mountain range surrounding the sea, right, with the Mount Sumeru at the center, right? Then the 4 continents surrounding us. So actually, they assembled the Mahayana Tripitaka in that place. Right? So at that time, there was already such kind of thing called Bodhisattva Pitaka. As I mentioned, this is a Mahayana thing. So according to the series of Mahayana texts, right, it has been believed that Buddha continued to preach right, after parinirvana. His Manjushri was summoned, Manjushri, right, this time, according to this version, was the person that actually summoned the Bodhisattva and the great arhats to assemble the Mahayana Canon. Tripitaka was responsible for relating the Prajnaparamita literature. Right? We know Prajnaparamita literature is the first type of the Mahayana scriptures. So it has its mystical kind of origin in such kind of legends. So I want to bypass this. I already talked about this, right? So this is kind of a one picture of Buddhist cosmology. It's a very specialized kind of knowledge about exactly how this world was formed, right? In the center is always this gigantic Mount Sumeru, right? And there are kind of a continent surrounding the mountain, right? An outer rim, there are mountain range, right? 7 of them. And human beings live at the south, right? Tripitaka. If you remember my last lecture about Journey to the West, right? Tripitaka has been frequently referred to because human beings live there. Right? Human beings live there. Okay, Vimalakirti Sutra. Right? Vimalakirti Sutra also praised Mahayana Canon. Right? So they said Mahayana Canon is actually very profound, right? Difficult to perceive and comprehended by the world. Right? So of course, we desire a Mahayana Canon. If you read Vimalakirti or text like this, before you go into India, you probably want to get that. Right? So you know there's something called Mahayana Tripitaka. So that's the second theme I identified. So this is a third one, right? So that's about physical, right? Physicality of the canon as written words. I already said this couldn't be true during Buddha's time, right? But Chinese, the Chinese at the time, they encountered Buddhism, the written culture, that's dominant culture. Right? So Chinese kind of different from the Indian tradition, just favor written words. Right? The Indian tradition rather tied to the oral tradition. Right? So we always think oral tradition is not stable, but it could be remarkably stable. If somebody devoted his life, profession, just to memorizing Buddhist texts, right? You can imagine how accurate. Right? So actually, many reports said it's actually very accurate in the oral transmission. So then we can see the written culture. Because of this, the Chinese overwhelmingly imagine the canon is a physical existence, right? During the time when it was produced in the early Buddhist concert. So then they have a lot of interesting accounts about such kind of a written canon. Right? For example, right, in Dao Shi, this is Tang Dynasty encyclopedia called Fa Yuan Zhu Lin. Right? It says, after Kasyapa finished the canon, the canon we have assembled, assembly, council, then it was first written down in manuscript form. It says so clearly, it's a manuscript there. Then he asked the king, right, Ajatasastru, who supported the first council, he was the sponsor here, to transcribe in 5 copies. And immediately there are 5 copies. After being copied, this manuscript must be certified with different kinds of seals made of gold, silver, precious gems. Right? So using the seal probably is distinctly Chinese practice. Right? It's a Chinese practice, like the emperor, government officials, they use stamps, right? The seal to certify this is true scripture. Right? So you can see here the Chinese just use their imagination. They thought things should be certified. When the canon was produced, there got to be an authoritative kind of agency to certify that as true or authentic. So then, after being sent to the sea, the canon was put in the golden vase, right, to be brought to the fragrance mountain and to be worshipped together with the pagoda. Right. So this is an interesting kind of words about the canon. Right. So also, right, so this is not completely baseless, by the way. Right? So if you look at the Indian scriptures, some scriptures, right, depending on the time when they were created, they all refer to the physical existence. Probably not the entire canon, but however, at least the text. Right? Some scriptures which have been written down. Right? For example, some sources indicated you can borrow a scripture. Right? But however, if you don't return it, it is quiet. What it implies is that scripture has become a physical existence. You can borrow that. Right? It's not something in people's mind, but you just check it out, but you have to return it. Right? And in the travelogue of Yi Jing, right? So this is a Tang Dynasty monk. He visited India, right? Twice actually, and he mentioned there's special kind of a storage cascade. Right? It's kind of a box which holds scriptures. Right? So we're very curious about this kind of a box, a storage cabinet. What exactly contained in those baskets? How people use that? Right? Is that a way to store Buddhist canon? Right? We don't know. We don't have further information about that. So Dao Shi, so I already mentioned this, so I want to bypass this to another record. For example, in the dynastic history, when it referred to Buddhism, then it relates to Buddhist council, no problem about that. Right? So then it says, collect and wrote it down. Right? It is clearly indicated, according to the Chinese, this has been written. This has been written. But although we know it is contrary, right? It's contrary to the fact. Right? So once again, we quote from Dao Shi, his encyclopedia. Right? So what he said, this remark about the canon, right? He said very interesting. The Buddha instructed Madhyayana that the Sutra Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka was stored in the golden pagoda with 80,000 pavilions made of silver and pearls. 6 monks reside in the pagoda, and Prakuchata Buddha, right, instructed them the tower should be open when the future Buddha is about to enter nirvana, and they should take one book of the canon written in 64 different kind of scripts. So after the canon was assembled, the canon should be copied solemnly and should use different scripts in different copies. So they imagine the canon when it's stored, it has been kind of written down, and people can copy those, right? People copy that, transcribe that again and again. So this simply reflects the manuscript culture during the Tang Dynasty. Right? So this is very likely the Chinese imagine the canon, how the canon has been made in India based on their own experience, right, with the writing culture. So then, right, so there's another subject I want to focus on. This should be number 4, the physical location. So after we understand the Chinese believe it is a physical existence, then there must be a location. The Chinese fantasized about the mythological location, where it is, the canon, right? Because Chinese want to go and get there. Right? You see, turning to the west, they went to the Sangha temple, right, monastery, because they believe that's Buddha, the place Buddha lived. Then you can go there and get a canon. So here, overwhelmingly, they believe there's a physical place. So there are places like Dragon King's Palace and the sea. Right? So later we will see some records about that. Once again, goes back to this Mahayana scripture on the incarnation of Bodhisattva. Then you have this Buddha preach the Mahayana scripture in 3 different kind of places. Right? Ananda and his disciples didn't know that. Of course, they assembled the scripture on the earth in Rajagriha, but they don't know actually Buddha preached Mahayana scriptures in the heaven, right? Of 33 gods. Right? So this is one of the upper realm, right? To his mother Maya, right? To his mother Maya. Right? Also, he has been going down to the sea, right, to preach the canon to the Naga kings, right? Naga kings. And also in his mother's womb for 9 months, right? Before he was born, right? Before he was born. So the legends actually surrounding this interesting kind of places, and then Chinese fantasize about that. So dynasty, here we're talking about 10th century. Actually, unanimously among the Chinese community, there's such kind of a belief that there are 2 kinds of places you can store Buddhist canon. Right? So here a quote from a encyclopedia, right, called Shimen Zhengtong, right, Orthodox translation of the Buddhism. And nowadays, this device, later we'll come back to this device. This device is the revolving repository of the canon. Right? So we'll come back to this. It's called the Ocean Storage in the Dragon Palace. right? So this is showing, okay, the canon has been stored in a structure. This structure has been named, according to the legend, right? The ocean storage in Dragon's Place. It has been said that this is based on the event that Nagarjuna, right? So this time is Nagarjuna dive into the sea to fetch the sutra, because all the scriptures, the canon, has been brought by the dragon kings to the sea. Right? So why it has to be put in the sea? Because there's a discourse in Indian Buddhism that Buddha Dhamma is actually declining. Right? It's declining. It's going to disappear. Right? Something got to be done to preserve Buddhist teaching. Right? So some of the Buddhist scripture, right, the Tripitaka, has been entrusted to the dragon kings. Dragon kings. So this saying is based on Shakyamuni's resting. Oh, there's another structure, right? The same structure has been also named the treasure storage in the heavenly palace, right? So the reason is that the legend says Shakyamuni has ascended to the heaven of 33, right, and preached the teaching there, right? So that's, of course, a place where you can find Buddhist canon, right? Because it's some versions. And Dao Xuan, right, if we come back to this Tang Dynasty monk, this is all Tang Dynasty monk, probably kind of a little bit later than Xuanzang, right, than the great pilgrim. So he wrote a very interesting work to describe Jetavana, right, the Jetavana, the great temple monastery. He didn't go to India. So there's no way he actually witnessed anything happen in Indian tradition. But he has this kind of imagination, and in his imagination, there's a place for the canon. Right? There's a place for the canon. He said in the past, 1,300 billion Buddhas preached the Vinaya. Right? Every Buddha's teaching is not identical, right? Different kinds. There are sutras, Abhidhamma, as well as books on yin and the yang. Right? So these are the Chinese terms, yin and the yang. Right? Calculation skills and the measurement. Right? So this is something kind of a not very Buddhist, completely secular, but however they were incorporated into the canon, all of which differ according to practice and theory. All this exists today, and the original canon of Tripitaka is in the dragon's palace of Sagara. You see, we have the name. There are many Naga kings, right? So one of them called Sagara. Actually, he has been entrusted with preserving the canon. Well, the books on yin and yang, so these are the secular sources, books, are in the Vajra cave on the Mount Sumeru. So this is another version of the places. So this is some kind of places you can identify, although it's not in this world. So a couple of places mention the dragon. Right? So dragon cult is very popular in China. Right? So a lot of the legends related to dragon. So one of the responsibility for the dragon is actually to take care of the Tripitaka. Right? So in the canon, we find interesting texts describe dragon kings. Right? So I just have examples here. Then you can see they all deal with dragon. They're dealing with the Buddha. Right? So Buddha converted them, of course, and preached them teaching. And they all, the dragons, they all vow to protect Buddhism. Right? So they become the protectors of Buddhism. And the sutra, right? For example, I quote from this sutra called Lian Hua Mian Jing. Right? It says, before the Buddha entered into nirvana, right? He actually traveled to heavens and also entered the sea to assuage gods and dragon kings and entrust the Buddha's teaching to them. And so he knows he's entering nirvana, so he got to be places to put his teaching. Then this dragon king Sagara, that he should guard the teaching against all evil dragons. So he was the dragon who had this kind of responsibility. He also went to the dragon king Taska and the black dragon king, right? So he said the same thing. The Buddha said the same thing. Right? So you can see the place, if you want to get, is actually going under the sea. Right? So this is what happened when Nagarjuna, right? So he discovered the scripture actually in the dragon's palace. Right? Dragon's palace. So the pious dragon kings were so devout, so they were willing to make offerings to the Buddha and his teaching in their palace. Many scriptures mention explicitly that Buddha instructed Dragon King to safeguard the teaching. So we have lots of such kind of a reference to Dragon Kings. So here is a picture about the temple of the Dragon King. You can see the Dragon King was the main figure. By the way, the job, people worship Dragon King because he can make rings. Right? So this is the reason he was worshipped, not because he protected his canon. Right? So this has been mentioned in the scriptures, but I didn't see any explicit kind of work or cultic activities which surround this kind of legend. So the heavenly palace, right? We talk about the heaven, the dragon under the sea, and also the heaven up in the sky. And according to legends, right, Buddha actually ascended to the heaven of the 33 and expounded the teaching to his mother. Right? And the Sutra of the Mahayana, Mahamaya, right? So that's his mother. Also, right, relate a similar story. Right? So the heaven is also a destination for people to find the canon. So here I just give you examples, right, to show you how rich such kind of a discourse can become, right? And they are all legends and imaginations. So the last one is about numbers. As I said, I become fascinated with numbers, right? It's a little bit addictive, right? When you deal with number, you want to count them, right? And this exactly happened to Chinese Buddhists. When they received the scripture and the Indian scripture mentioned number, they were wondering, okay, they didn't say, see, this is a legend, or not true. They thought this must be something there. So they come up with a number. They want to come up with the number, the right number, why the number is like that. So the Chinese try hard to understand the Indian tradition of numerology, right? And concerning the different kinds of numbers. We have the number like 84,000. I mentioned this is another magic number. If we want to know how much Buddhist teachings in Indian, this is probably the number. Right? And the Chinese want to match that. And Koreans want to match that when they created the canon. So they want to reconcile the discrepancies among these different kind of numerical descriptions. So what they did is quite remarkable. Eventually, right, as a compilation of Zhishen's Tripitaka catalog in the 9th century China, so I mentioned this standard, this became the standard catalog, right, the magic number is 5,048. Right. So on one side we have 80,000, right, 84,000. On the other side, in China, we have this number 5,048. Right. It got into the popular memory, consciousness, right, so this is very pervading kind of evidence. Right? So we have a canonical tradition established. So let's count the number. Right? So the Chinese, as I said, Chinese absolutely took the number very seriously. Right? So I encounter examples of how they actually count the number. Right? I call these people Buddhist accountant. Right? So they just like numbers. When they count numbers, they just keep counting. In this work, right, what is interesting is that the author actually reasoned about why Buddha or the Indian text has been referring to this number, 84,000. Right? He come up with a solution, right? See if that's right. So his teaching, the Buddha's teaching, can be divided into 350 gates. Right? So this is how he reasoned, right? Calculated. Then there are 6 subdivisions, right? In each gate, right? You multiply, and then that's amount to 2,010, 100 in total. This number is multiplied by 4. Right? If you multiply by 4, then that's 8,400, right? Which will be 84,000 if you multiply by 10. Right? Just do this kind of a multiplication kind of a exercise. So then you get the right number. So this is how this author, right, came up with the number. So there's another way to calculate this. So I encounter a text which tells this kind of a formula. Right? So the Buddha in total gave 350 sermons. right? So this is 350 sermons in assembly, and each contains six prajna, right, wisdom. So then 350 is multiplied by 6. The result is 2100. Also, because each of them destroy 4 greatness and 6 mundanes, therefore the number has to be multiplied by 10 and thus reach 21,000. Right? So you see 4 greatness and 6 mundanes, you plus add it together, that's 10. Right? So that got to be multiplied by 10. Right? So according to G, right, so this apparently written after G's work. Right? According to G, there are 4 divisions, right, of the Buddhist teaching. Right? So then there are also 4 delusional phenomena. Right? The 3 poisons of greed, anger, ignorance, plus the simultaneous appearance of all 3 poisons. Right? So this is what the 3 poisons plus the last one, right? Simultaneously emergence of all 3. Right? That's 4. Then the number you multiply by 4 will be 84,000. So this is Chinese. Some Chinese took that very seriously. Right? So this is number got to be solved. Right? You cannot just live as speculation. Right? But however, it's got to be a solution. Right? Got to be a solution. Okay. So here is another reference to 84,000. There are numerous such kind of a reference. Right? I simply bypass this and reach my conclusion for today's lecture. Right? Okay, so in this lecture, I give you samples from various kind of sources. Right? The point is that these are all imaginative work, of course. I don't want to claim we are digging out new evidence for solving the problem of Buddhist council and the creation of Buddhist canon in India. Right? But however, these are the imagination which merit our further investigation. Right? It is part of what I call the canon. Right? And so here, called a book is another phrase used by another professor. And we're going to talk about it in the next lecture. So the cult of canon here refers to the series of devotional activities involving the creation, distribution, maintenance of the canon. But the motivation, the reason why such kind of devotion has been directed to canon, because a Tripitaka Discourse has taken form, right? And imagination, right? It started to become the motive, right, for people to invest in such kind of a cult, right? Engage in such kind of activity. So Chinese Buddhists developed a Tripitaka complex. Right? So this is something in people's mind. Right? People just, although people don't read the entire canon, right? It's going to be a task, right? Very difficult to complete. Not everybody can do that. But people know there's a canon, they need to take care of that. Right? So in the popular consciousness, because of such kind of a discourse, the imagination, right? You can say there's such kind of Tripitaka complex, right, developed. Such a complex implies that the Chinese creation of the canon was a continuation of the canonical tradition as seen in the legends contained in the translated Indian sources. So of course, in the Indian sources we can see similar imaginations as well. The Chinese developed that. Right? This is probably what's going on in the Buddhist community. Right? So imagination plays such an important role, right, to bridge the gap, and the gap between China and India at that time, right? The gap between East and West, because not everybody can go there and see. Then they fill the gap with imagination. So the canon formation in China, we have to take account of such kind of imagination. So I ended this lecture. So I have a few study questions, right? So if I have time, we later can discuss those, right? Be sure to kind of review those questions, right? So what exactly is the role of religious imagination? We probably don't believe imagination has a function. We just despise that. Right? Imagination is nothing. It's so weak. Right? It's not as strong as reason. Describe the first council, right? Find the source, read that, and see how the council has been described. Compare with standard version. And what are the 5 aspects or themes of legends in Chinese sources concerning the Buddhist canon? Right? So see if we can kind of make use of these sources, identify something interesting. Right? Okay, I want to stop here for my lecture. Right? I hope you all get something from these sources and my notes.